Good morning, good evening, everyone, wherever you are. Welcome to our event, Developing Inclusive City Neighborhoods, the cases of Chicago and Montevideo. I am Melissa Borodinovac. I am a Learning and Knowledge Generation Analyst at UNDP. This is the webinar number 30 in our SDG Local Solution Series. It's an initiative from UNDP that highlights how local and regional governments are implementing the 2030 agenda through practical and concrete local solutions. Our past webinars are in our YouTube channel and in our website, and I will be sharing the links so you can access to them. We have interpretation in English, French, and Spanish. To access them, you have to click on the small globe icon at the bottom right and select your preferred language. Tenemos interpretación en español. Para acceder tienen que hacer clic en el pequeño mundito que está ubicado en el Zoom, abajo a la derecha, y allí pueden seleccionar el idioma. Nous avons de interprétation en français. Veuillez cliquer sur le petit globe en bas à droite, puis sélectionnez votre langue. I invite you to use the chat. You can use the chat to introduce yourself, to share your stories, and also ask questions to our presenters. And now I will introduce our speakers. First, we have Roberto Requejo, who is the board director from Chicago Transit Authority, senior fellow at the Center for Community Investment, and Lucia Soca, who is advisor in the Department of Urban Development of the Government of Montevideo. And finally, our moderator, Adela Posder-Chengich, policy advice specialist at the Government Rule of Law and Peace Building Hub at UNDP. Thank you all for joining us. We are very excited for this an inspiring session, and welcome, Adela. The floor is all yours.
Thank you, Melissa. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you're joining us from around the world. A very warm welcome. As mentioned, this webinar is part of SDG Local Series brought to you by UNDP. My name is Adela, and I'm pleased to be your moderator today. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this important conversation on how cities can build more inclusive neighborhoods. A special thank you go to Roberto and Lucia for joining us today to share insights from their city administrations. The topic cannot be more timely, I would say. Urbanization is reshaping our societies. And as you know, by 2050, nearly 70% of the world's population will be living in cities. So the way we manage or design our neighborhoods will very much impact on the people's quality of life, as well as on the equality, resilience, and social cohesion. At UNDP, we believe that inclusive urban development is more than physical infrastructure. It's about creating environments where everyone, every resident, no matter their background, has the opportunity to live with dignity, access quality services, and participate in the life of their community. Obviously, this requires a shift in how we think about and also how we govern our cities. It requires placing people at the center, fostering social connection, and ensuring that trust, equity, and inclusion are shaping our urban planning and decision-making. To get there, we need long-term planning. We need to address inequality. We need to strengthen resilience and ensure that women, youth, migrants, refugees, other marginalized groups are part of shaping the spaces they call home. And all this is not theoretical. These ideas are not theoretical. They are being put into practice in many cities around the world. For example, Medellin in Colombia has invested in innovative mobility solutions to connect previously secluded or neighborhoods to the rest of the cities, introducing cable cars and escalators. Another example is Ahmedabad in India, where local partnerships are transforming informal settlements into legal service neighborhoods. And today we have the pleasure to hear from Chicago about their efforts to create welcoming spaces for migrants and refugees, as well as from Montevideo, where the Habitat program supports cooperative housing and community-led construction. These are all inspiring examples of how local governments can lead change through policy, through planning, community engagement, and also collaboration across sectors. So once again, thank you very much for being with us today. We look forward to learning together, to exploring how to build cities and neighborhoods that truly leave no one behind. And now it's my pleasure to hand over to Roberto, who will share Chicago's experience in building a more inclusive urban environment. Roberto, over to you.
Thank you so much, Adela, and thank you also, Melissa, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here this morning for me here in Chicago, and afternoon and evening for many of the people attending. And it's also a pleasure and an honor to share with the space with Lucia Soca in Montevideo. First of all, a few things about myself. My name is Roberto Requejo. I'm an urban planner based here in Chicago. I've been here for 24 years now, working mainly on community development in neighborhoods and how to connect those neighborhoods through transit to opportunities and to ways of being more inclusive as a community. I'll tell you a little bit more about Chicago in a few minutes. In terms of my different hats that I wear, I am currently a senior fellow at the Center for Community Investment, which is a think tank and also a practice of community development based in DC with projects all around the United States to advance community development in cities, in rural areas too. And I'm also a director in the Chicago Transit Authority, which is the public transit agency serving the Chicago region. Let me see if I can share now my screen to show you a few things about the beautiful city of Chicago. There we go. First of all, I wanted to start by telling you a bit about the city itself. We are a global city with a very diverse population, a very diverse economy. Our GDP is about or $833 billion. And we have multiple cultural assets, universities, transit stops, but all this wealth and all these assets are not distributed equitably. And our main challenge actually in the city is racial segregation. And this racial segregation is rooted in racist policies that date back to the 19th century and were maintained through the 20th century. And these practices are not exclusive to the city of Chicago. As you are very familiar with, most American cities show this type of segregation too. And as a result, our city is comprised of 77 community areas. That's how we call the districts that shape our city, and they're shown here in this map. And a lot of these neighborhoods have majority Black, Latino, or white population. So some of these Communities in the south and the west side are 80, 90% Black. Some of them are 80, 90% Latino. And the ones in the north side of the city are often like 70, 80% white. So the exception in Chicago, unfortunately, is diverse communities. Most of our city is segregated by race. The cost of this segregation has been quantified actually by an organization called the Metropolitan Planning Council. They did a very thorough study that showed that this costs our city over $4.4 billion every year in a variety of ways. And it affects everything from economic opportunity to health outcomes, including a 16-year life expectancy gap between white and Black neighborhoods. So many of our residents in Black neighborhoods live 16 years less than folks in the north side of Chicago. Another way this segregation shows up, and this is something that many of the people in this webinar are also familiar with, is in the form of displacement of people of color. And we have two types of displacement going on in the city. A type of displacement that is connected to gentrification, so especially in majority Latino neighborhoods, and also some majority Black neighborhoods, new development kicks out people and displaces people from communities where they used to live because the new development is not affordable to them. So that's one type. The other type of gentrification of displacement, that we experience is based on the opposite, is based on disinvestment. And some of our African American communities in particular have suffered so much disinvestment. They've been cut off the economy, they've been taken, schools have been closed, grocery stores have left, transit stops have been closed too. And a lot of the residents decided to leave in search of better opportunities outside of Chicago too. In the past 20 years, more than 200,000 Black residents have left Chicago to a great extent due to this disinvestment. But on the positive side, we have one asset that actually extends throughout the city in every neighborhood and has regular service. And that asset that is there present and has been there for 100+ years is our transit system. It covers almost every neighborhood. It's a very strong rail system, but we also have a bus lines system with more than 10,000 stops. And that is spread throughout the city in a pretty equitable way, although we do have a few transit deserts. And one more thing to keep in mind is that while we have that wealth of transit, more than 10,000 vacant lots and vacant properties are adjacent or nearby transit stations. So one thing that we thought about was how can we put this wealth to work? How can we leverage the capacity of transit to address this investment? And many of you are familiar with the concept of transit-oriented development. That's a trend or a way of thinking that started in the US in the 90s, and basically is policies that cities started to encourage more compact, more walkable, more transit-friendly neighborhoods. And usually these policies look like incentives and easier zoning for developers who want to build near transit hubs. So in Chicago, we thought, well, let's use that, right? Like since 60% of transit users in our city are people of color, if we build near transit through transit-oriented development, we will benefit those people. And the city council, thinking this way, passed an ordinance in 2013. But unfortunately, that policy did the opposite. The transit-oriented policy, or TOD ordinance of 2013, resulted in the map that I'm showing you in this slide, where instead of addressing the issues of exclusion and disinvestment, we actually exacerbated those problems. And as you can see, because we didn't have an equity lens, the market led the results, and development happened near transit in the north side and along the the diagonal that you see here along the blue line of the train that goes to the airport, and the rest of Chicago saw very little development. So those areas that you see where development took place were already wealthy areas or gentrifying communities where Latino neighborhoods in particular, like the one on the left side, went from being the slide on the top, a very vibrant immigrant community with small businesses, to be uprooted, and those buildings that you see on the bottom were developed. These are luxury apartments and very small, so working families, immigrant families can fit and can afford living there, and the businesses couldn't afford. So in those communities, TOD actually exacerbated displacement. On the right side, you see the opposite of this. So as you can see, the west and the south sides of the map have very, very little development. Even with an investment of $300 million in that beautiful station that you see on the right side, because the city didn't think through an equity lens, they plopped that station. As you can see, it's surrounded by vacant lots, parking lots, chains instead of local businesses, and there was no real development taking place. So we showed up as a coalition called Elevate Chicago in 2017. I was the executive director there for 7 years. And we approached the city and said, we can do this better. We can redefine transit-oriented development to solve rather than exacerbate disparities. And we told the city that TOD without an equitable lens was a false solution. And the true solution was leading with equity, any transit-oriented development. Our coalition included the city of Chicago, philanthropy, financial institutions, think tanks, artists, a very diverse group of community-based organizations. And together we developed our model that we called ETOD, or Equitable Transit-Oriented Development. And this is, Adela was referring to this in the introduction. This was much more than just building near transit, much more than just buildings. It was about centering equity and community and ensuring that new developments served the people that have been traditionally excluded from decision-making. So we prioritized community engagement. We prioritized planning with communities rather than for communities. And we prioritize inclusion. And in our own coalition, we made sure that the majority of our coalition was people of color, people with disabilities, young people, and people from across races, incomes, etc. So 8 years later, the map shows this way, which is very different from the map that I showed you before. After a lot of work with the city, policies, ordinances being changed, a movement being created, as you can see now, the city has 60 ETOD sites. And these look like affordable homes, commercial space for local businesses, health clinics, community centers, and many of them surrounded by walkability improvements, public art, green infrastructure, and all of it co-designed with community. And here are 2 examples. The one on the top is the very same community that I showed you earlier, where people have been excluded, or the Latino community have been displaced. This here is just one stop north of that one, and it's a 100% affordable community with 100 units for residents in the community, and a lot of those residents being immigrants and refugees that are paying only a third of their income every month for as long as they qualify for the homes. And they are going to also be building around this building plaza that is inspiring Latin American plazas to bring a sense of connectivity and connection with the culture of that community. So as opposed to those buildings that you saw before, who could be in any city in the world, they're just boxes of glass and steel. Here we want to make sure that this reflects, the community that lives there. And then on the bottom of the slide, you see an example from that other area where I show you this investment and the lack of development. This is a majority African-American community where, as you can see, next to the train station, 2 buildings are being built. And these are mixed income communities where you have market rate units and also subsidized units for people of all income levels to live together next to the train. These were 2 lots that have been vacant for decades, and that a developer, a private developer, working with the city of Chicago and our coalition, was able to redevelop into this beautiful community in a traditionally and historically Black community called Brownsville in Chicago. So with this, what I want to make sure is that for all of you who are working in transit-oriented development, you understand that there's a big difference between these 2 ways of approaching things. The TOD model is focused on attracting new residents. ETOD is about retaining first the ones who live there and then attract residents. So you don't want to exclude the people who already live there from the benefits. It's also about developing with communities instead of for communities, and also approaching this from the multi-sector perspective instead of just through a market-driven approach. Also very important, in addition to the equity lens, we were very careful to look at the climate, health, and cultural lenses as we design these communities and make sure the indicators showed up. And here are some examples of how those indicators show up when you do this through an equitable lens. These are just a few quantitative indicators of how ETOD helps advance the SDG indicators. We chose the 6 here, which are the most representative of how we align with the goals. And what I want to say is that this covers everything from health improvements, like obesity rates being 3 times less, to decent work and economic growth with property values going up 40%, retail sales 88%, jobs being created through construction, and also through the businesses that moved into these communities, and also definitely increases or improvements in climate goals too, with lower emissions and reduction of temperature in these communities. Now, the most important part of these goals and metrics is that because we drive this effort through an equity lens, these are not concentrated in just one community or one type of resident. These are spread throughout communities and residents. So it's not okay to increase these indicators and make them better if they are not spread equitably, throughout the city. So what we did here is to make sure that if obesity rates are going to be improving, we focus on those communities that have the highest obesity rates, rather than make it even better for folks who already have opportunities. And just to close this quick introduction, just wanted to show you a few examples of what these communities look like. When you see presentations about TOD, usually they look like the buildings on top, like a beautiful building in the left. On the left is a rental community with businesses on the first floor. And these are all local businesses, by the way, in the south side of Chicago. On the right side, you see a building. On the north side, this is a very affluent area where a parking lot was redeveloped into a mixed-use community, which also tries to retain artists in the community that could not afford living there. But I wanted to bring also the other part that you don't see in TOD presentations, but you will see in ETOD, which is the people part. And again, this is about mobilizing people. And these are pictures of the people who make this work. On the first slide on the bottom, this is the private developer that sat at that corner that I showed you before, with those 2 buildings next to the train station. Every week, he was there showing the community residents his vision and recruiting more and more community residents in support of the development. In the middle slide, these are a group of small developers that have received grants to start small projects throughout in the city of Chicago, connected to transit, from small businesses to housing opportunities to health clinics. And then on the right, bottom right, is a group of technical assistance providers that our coalition assembled to provide free support to those developers, because starting things like this is hard when the system is doing things just one way. So we wanted to make sure that when these folks started their housing development, their small businesses plan, their community center, they had free lawyers, free architects, free communication experts, free urban planners, free data providers to support them all along the way to transform vacant land or underutilized land into an equitable development. Making sure that the benefits went first to the people who lived in the community instead of displacing them. So I'm going to stop here, and I'm happy to answer any questions later on. Just wanted to give you a taste of our efforts to make Chicago more inclusive through equitable transit-oriented development.
Thank you very much, Roberto, for this a very insightful presentation, showing us how in a relatively short period of time, if I understood well, 8 years, you can actually turn things around. If you use data and if you set your goals right in terms of what you shared about equitable TOD and your ambition to retain residents, but then also to attract additional and new residents to those areas. And I loved also the way you presented the impact in terms of health, economic development, climate mitigation benefits, but then at the same time putting the accent on ensuring that these benefits are equally spread across very diverse communities of Chicago, and showing us really in practice what it means to put people at the center of our policy and interventions. Thank you very much for this. I'm turning now to Lucia to ask her to share any question or reflection with Roberto regarding his presentation. So Lucia, over to you.
Thank you, Adela. Thank you, Roberto, for this presentation. It was wonderful to hear how user-oriented strategy can make government change their ideas. And my question goes right to that point. How, from a coalition outside the government, what was the strategy to convince the policymakers that this was a good path to take? Because as we know, sometimes bureaucracies can be kind of hard to change.
Yes, no, that's a great question, Lucia. And it was work. It was a lot of work. And I think the main advice I would provide if somebody wants to create something like this is know your audience, right? Know your audience and speak to the needs of each of those policymakers. So a couple things. One, when people think about transportation and development, they think, oh, Department of Planning. I'm going to talk to the mayor's office and I'm going to talk to the Department of Planning and get them together. We did that in 2013. And what happened was that first map that I showed you. So we thought, okay, wait, this is not just a planning and development effort. We need to bring in the housing department. They care about affordable housing and speak the language of affordable housing development. And we also said, and we need also the Department of Public Health, because I showed you that map before with the 16 years difference between communities. They had done an atlas showing how each neighborhood showed up in terms of health indicators. And they were extremely interested in creating more active transportation options, walkability, and ways to decrease that. We also brought in the environmental folks too, who cared about less car access or less car dependency and more access to public transportation. So when you think about policymakers, we thought, how can we convince not just the usual suspects, but a very large and diverse group of them and bring them together too. So one thing was having these one-on-ones meetings and telling them, hey, would you like to join this coalition? Here's what's in it for you, for your department, for your goals, for the mayor. And then we created a leadership council. And that was a group of city officials, commissioners of the different departments, mayor's office folks, and also people from the Transit Authority, from the regional metropolitan planning organization, so beyond the city limits, the metropolitan planning organization, and a few other decision makers to keep each other accountable and also to, in a way, create some healthy competition in front of the community, right? Because they would show up in our coalition and then they would get questions from our members and they want to make sure that they had good answers to that. So we did that on one hand, working with the city departments and the mayor's office, speaking to their needs and their goals. Each of them had plans, so we made sure our plan aligned with their plan. That was not something new. And then the other thing to work with was with our elected representatives. These are the council members. Chicago has 50 council members. Is a pretty record number in terms of Chicago. So we brought in some champions, council members that represented these communities, from disinvested African-American communities to gentrifying Latino communities to wealthy white communities, and create a group of them that could speak to the diversity of our city and how they were all for equitable transit-oriented development and bring with them the rest. And again, we showed up in their community, in their district, and we showed them this is how this corner could look like. This is how your transit stop could look like, right? And so those were the two strategies that we used, and through those we were able to pass an ETOD policy plan, and also more importantly, equitable transit-oriented development ordinance that changed zoning in the city in 12 different ways to make developers who build near transit benefit economically through those changes. So just a few ideas on how we work with policymakers.
Thank you very much. I have tons of questions, and I see that there's a lot of traffic also in the chat, but we will leave that for the end, and I hope we will have time to discuss more. And I'm also puzzled how to share this great experience with other cities in developing countries to support them in similar efforts. But let me now turn to Lucia to hear about the experience from Montevideo, and then we will go back to broader discussion, engaging also with our audience. Lucia, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Adela, and thank you, Melissa, also for the invitation. Thank you, Roberto, for your presentation. I will be presenting in Spanish today, but I'm happy to take questions in English also. So I will share here my screen.
Okay, good morning. It's a pleasure for the Mayor's Office in Montevideo to present the habitat policy that we consider it's a policy of proximity, participation, engagement, and has allowed us to explore some issues that have to do with neighborhood transformation. A context: Montevideo is the capital of Uruguay, has 1.5 million of inhabitants. As it happens with all the cities in the region, in the world, also has concentration in some gentrified areas, and also some areas suffer urban segregation. Regarding informality, Montevideo has 345 informal settlements that equal more or less 37,000 houses, and we have 62 neighborhoods organized in 8 municipalities. For the local governments of the region and also the world, of course, we are impacted by inequalities. There are growing complexities, social complexities, violence, insecurity, and also the local governments were strongly impacted by multiple crises. The last one was COVID-19. And for us, for Montevideo, this was a crisis of engagement because it affected the participation spaces and it also affected the use of public spaces, especially in the case of women. And also we are seeing, as we are seeing in the whole region, and this is part of a study done by UNDP in 2019, that there is a growing distrust in institutions. From 2009 to 2019, the trust in the institutions has dropped significantly, and we believe that local governments have a very special role to play in really putting institutions closer to citizens. So we started to think, how is it that we can redesign our policies to make them more comprehensive? Bear in mind 4 pillars, 4 assumptions that at the time were theoretical. First, to design a proximity policy that relates the urban and the social. As Roberto was telling us, not everything is in the planning department. We always have to design policies that should involve other interests. Then the neighborhood or the territory should be our regulatory framework, our organizing unit. I will talk about this later on. Then to focus on action and the action capacity that local governments have, and always putting the people at the center, the engagement, the participation at the center, and also to have a permanent dialogue as the foundation of the political practice of the local government. In this, with this strategy, we intervene 60 informal settlements, but we chose 4 critical areas in Montevideo that allowed us to have a more systemic approach on urban segregation. So in these 4 critical areas, we consider the neighborhood as an ecosystem in order to approach different aspects of this complexity that the local government confronts. Montevideo confronts. So we wanted to follow 3 channels. First, we had to interpret correctly the neighborhood to generate real possibilities of change in the ecosystem, and also to create a collective account, a story about the interpretation. So to have an appropriate interpretation, the daily life of the people in the neighborhood was fundamental. That was our input in order to generate the policy. To generate real possibilities of change, we generated spaces for co-creation of solutions. We applied an internal governance in order to apply multi-sectorial activities, and we had to adapt to the different interventions. And also we used a portfolio of options or policies that intervened in every neighborhood in a different way. I will give you 2 examples that I will present later on. And in terms of building the narrative about this transformation, we wanted to focus on being very close to the citizenship to generate more trust in the institutions, in the government of Montevideo. And one of the ways we used was to always be transparent and to have real-time information for the community. Besides, we use specific tools, and these were the tools that were the protagonists of our portfolio of options in every neighborhood. First, a public portfolio of lands that we feed progressively with the land that has a lot of debt in terms of taxes unpaid. We expropriate the land in order to make it part of the public portfolio, and there we can support housing development projects. And also we created new public spaces. That as far as big infrastructure. Then we added informal infrastructure, for example, streets, sanitation, public lighting, stormwater drainage, and interventions in water courses in order to mitigate climate change in the settlements that are most affected by climate change. And also we added interventions in culture, health, food, and also creation of employment. All this was worked upon with the citizenship in a methodology of active listening. And we established neighborhood tables and rounds in order to design our action portfolio in every neighborhood. And here we brought 2 examples that we believe speak somehow of the method that we used in order to intervene in this direction. One is Piedras Blancas. It's a good example of how in a single critical area you can enter and implement many projects at the same time. This neighborhood, to give you the context, has a mix of formal and informal areas, high levels of fragmentation, high level of precariousness of housing, high levels of conflicts, insecurity, violence, and is very much impacted by climate change due to its high water risk. So we started applying our portfolio of actions. And the first thing that we did was the co-design of a public space where we could get together because that space did not exist in this neighborhood. This public space currently is being built. That's why we have the renders that I show you here. And part of the public portfolio of lands that we have in Montevideo was used to set up a cooperative that it's called Project Convive, Coexist. There, 30 women, heads of households, built their houses. The mayor of Montevideo put the materials for the work, the technical knowledge, and the families put the labor for the building of their houses. These houses are finished. So we did another project of the capacity of the walkability. We did a collective mapping of the spaces of the area. We laid out the walkability of the area in order to do sidewalks and resting spaces. We made interventions in water courses for the eradication of garbage dumps. We built public spaces, resting spaces, as you can see on the right, at the bottom on the right, in order to give sustainability to this eradication of garbage dumps that we did. And on the other hand, we have the case of Casabo, which is a second example, where we implemented the project Casabo Connects. In this case, it was completely different. And this is what I wanted to show you with these two examples, given the fact that in Piedras Blancas, we had big infrastructure projects that were planned. But in Casabo, we did not have a project. And what we did was to start installing coordination spaces and also active conversation spaces with the neighbors, men and women, and they themselves defined that access to sanitation was the number one problem, the more pressing problem that they had at that time. So Casabo is a very different neighborhood. It's a settlement. It's 100% informal settlement. It's internally cohesive neighborhood, but it's segregated for the rest of the urban fabric, and it has high levels of neighborhood organization. That's why we could identify that the entry point in this neighborhood was sanitation. There, we found that more than 5,000 households had no connection to sanitation, with all the consequences in terms of environmental risks and risk on health. So we created this permanent space of active listening that was called intercommissions. We did a program of connection to sanitation house by house with materials, technical support, and families contributing the labor. And we made a public commitment of providing real-time information as we moved forward with the project. So here, now that the project is in implementation phase, of those 5,000 houses, we are serving 600 families. And as we move forward, we inform the neighborhood of the progress of the project. What are the learnings of these two methodologies of work? That in order to have a more inclusive neighborhood, which was one of the questions of this webinar, the neighborhood can be an organizing unit for our interventions because it shows first the problems and it makes us see the tools that we have to solve it. So we focus on the problem. The proposal from the public perspective improve if they are participatory, they improve in efficacy and effectiveness, and the complexity and the diversity of situations are not a problem, but rather an opportunity for the local government's actions. Also, we have learned as we created more inclusive neighborhoods, that the housing cannot be an isolated intervention. It is in a context of a neighborhood that also needs services, connectivity, mobility, as Roberto was saying, and that every territory has its specificity. So first we have to interpret collectively the problems with the citizenship. Then we have to think our plans internally in the government.
On the other hand, we learned that people living in this community neighbors are a social asset, and this has to be recognized as such. We need to recognize the organization that already exists in the neighborhood, the knowledge that exists in the neighborhood in and of itself, and this will surely help the local government. It helped us a lot increase the skill sets in innovation, in communication, and in measuring effects. In wrapping up, how about prospective future challenges in Montevideo to measure effects and impacts of this new working methodology? That is to say, to tell our story, to measure how this has modified the livelihoods, communities, and livelihoods, to keep prioritizing investing with the citizenship. This is our most important partnership for these effects, to invest the time required for these collaborative interventions that are not easy and that they are time consuming. Whatever is open to the community and requires participation will take longer. And to keep looking for these innovations that can emerge from participating spaces from each neighborhood in keeping the transformation of our neighborhoods in a more sustainable and inclusive manner. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lucia. Again, a very interesting experience. And I think, what you shared about looking at the neighborhoods as ecosystems and sort of applying systems thinking, coming up with the portfolio of options against your three-pronged strategy in a way. An additional aspect, I guess, that you highlighted that is also very crucial is learning and adapting as you move forward, and obviously focusing on very strong community engagement and community-driven efforts, contributing in terms of time, labor, ideas, etc. But I would like to turn now to Roberto just to ask if he has any question for you before we open for questions from the audience.
A very quick question, because I'd like to give a chance to participate to those that wrote their questions on the chat. My question is actually reflected by some of those that asked on the chat. Lucia, this process of rebuilding or generating trust in people is very complicated, especially the relationship between the government and neighborhoods being one that is highly fragmented and has always been very problematic. This is around the world. This includes Chicago. In Chicago, we went through lots of phases. First, we had to recognize that people were outraged and disappointed, and they were righteously so. And then we had to show that we were there for very good reasons and for real. So could you please show us some examples of your journey, that is, since you came down to the community to find out how the situation was doing, down to a point where you said, well, it is not perfect, but we can build on this foundation of trust. That is, how do you build trust and how you keep it over time? Thank you for your question. A very illustrative example is when we started our actions in Piedras Blancas, the land where we built the houses was squatted. We had to work with those informal settlers, with the squatters, in trying to get them trust us as a working team, and at the same time to provide a solution to that situation. That was our entry point. There were a group of families. They were around 100 different families that were outraged and that were distrusting us. They had squatted that land. So we took a commitment, we undertook the commitment to provide, to the best of our capacity, to provide infrastructure and housing for them in the neighborhood. So that was an initial squat, but from that, all the other interventions that I went through my presentation were resulted. A co-designed public space, the program to open up houses, to formalize the neighborhoods that were around that settling. And that is how we slowly but surely built trust. We then did not fragment our interventions. That is the problem, where we put things in order, where we constructed houses and the public space being a shared one. All the processes did not get fragmented. The entire neighborhood was well informed of all initiatives. We worked on a portfolio basis, but the narrative was always consistent and generally commonplace for the entire neighborhood. That could only bring trust. We had a lot to say. We had a lot to clarify. We said, well, this is for part of the neighborhood, but we're also interested in getting other neighbors to get to know what we are doing here. And the third strategy, in generating trust, we need to be sincere and honest. This looks pretty obvious, but many times for governments, it is not that obvious. So whenever there was a demand that was unmet or an unmet need that we weren't able to meet at the time, we didn't make false promises. We would rather say no, and we worked through the reasons why not. Maybe because we were having budgetary constraints, or because it hadn't been planned and then it was very costly for the authorities in Montevideo, or maybe because it was not part of our jurisdiction. It was the jurisdiction of the central government. All these measures may end up in a no, but we had to explain the reasons behind the no. That was something that neighbors deserved, getting explained or being explained why not. That generated a lot of trust. We did not generate any false expectations among them.
Thank you, Lucia. So let me start first with a set of questions for Roberto, to also give Lucia a bit of a time to catch her breath. So Roberto, what are the main governance or institutional conditions that cities need in place to successfully replicate ETOD outside of the US? And the question is more focused on cities from the global south. So let me also share additional 2 questions, if that's okay, and then you can answer them all together. How do you balance the interests of private developers with the goal of maintaining affordable housing in high-income areas? So that's another question. And the last one for you, in your experience, which types of cities in terms of size, density, governance are best positioned to adopt ETOD principles successfully? Over to you.
I'm going to mix or combine the first and the third one in one answer to give Lucia time for her questions. And I'll start by saying there is not one formula for ETOD. And that's another difference from ETOD and TOD. Like TOD is a formula that has been designed often by engineers and planners and transportation experts and developers. ETOD is rooted in community and in a wide variety of people coming together. So some of the conditions include starting with a diversity of experts and community leaders that all agree that the transit assets in their community, in their city, are underutilized and can be used better to generate development, and have that coalition define that first and develop that vision first. One thing that people often say is that, well, my city doesn't have a metro system, so how am I supposed to do this? You don't need a metro system. You don't need trains to make this work. Actually, in Chicago, more people take the buses than the trains, and our future expansions are most likely going to happen through bus rapid transit. Bus stops can be as thriving as a space as a train stop. So find also throughout your city, what are some of those most utilized or more or bus stops with the most potential, where you may have a strong community group in that neighborhood, and also a few nonprofit and for-profit partners that are willing to work together in designing this, and a city that is willing to pilot 1 or 2 locations if you haven't done this before, and bring that up to the entire city as an idea. And the other thing that helped in our case too is philanthropic support, right? If you have a foundation or a donor that can support the beginnings of this and be able to fund the starting of the coalition, the staffing of the coalition, make some small grants to get things around the stations or around the bus stops going, like activations, murals, paying attention, communications, narrative. Those are some of the ideas. You want to replicate this in other cities, and the ingredients that you could start with for an ETOD agenda. And happy to tell you more offline, and you can go to elevatedchicago.org too for more information. And for Fabian, the interest of private developers are like what I said at the beginning about the city. You have to cater to different types of audiences. When you are in a segregated city, there is not one type of developer. There are developers working in affluent areas, and for those developers, the incentives are different from the developers that are just trying to bring in development into this invested community with a lot of vacant land and a very soft and weak market. So aligning those incentives based on the market and the community is what made sense for us. So in the affluent communities, allowing for more density and eliminating the need to provide parking, which costs between $30,000 and $50,000 per unit in Chicago, was a huge incentive, right? In the south and the west sides, where the market was weak and there was this investment, the incentives there were looking like pre-development grants from the city to help organize, the beginning of the development and to assemble the land and cut the red tape that was preventing some of those lands, like Lucia mentioned, from being developed due to taxes that were not being paid or laws that were not being connected and all that. So the incentives for developers look differently, and we combine those also with mandates. So in affluent areas, you had to provide 20% of the units as affordable. So, and again, I can talk more about this, these incentives, or you can go to elevatedchicago.org for how the different markets were addressed.
Thank you, Roberto. And Lucia, a couple of questions for you. How do you ensure that the participatory mechanisms, such as neighborhood roundtables, remain effective and inclusive over time, rather than becoming symbolic? Another question, what measurable results have you observed so far in terms of improving trust in public institutions and reducing urban segregation? And the final question, to what extent do you think this portfolio approach to neighborhood transformation can be replicated in other Latin American cities with different governance systems and resources?
I will also try to answer all questions in one single answer. How do we ensure that participation will continue to be effective rather than symbolic or rather than lip service to it? Well, we go to the portfolio of options. One of the things that we had in our portfolio were the various intervention scales. Scales help us play along with those actions that we take in neighborhoods. So in keeping an effective participation, it's always good to get the materiality that pulls us in that direction. We can always change things slowly but surely. We don't change in a big scale, because when you do it small, this is maintained over time, and investment as a result doesn't have to be so high. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, measuring results, that's one of the notions towards the end of my presentation. Measuring this is a challenge for us, because since it is not business as usual for the Montevideo government, it's not the way they work, then they cannot measure it. We do have narratives, we do have more qualitative information, however, that we can share with you. As long as you send us an email, we will always be open to sharing reports and videos, but we still don't have that more quantitative measure or indicators that can illustrate us on this. We're working on it, however, but it'll take us a little longer to generate it. And to Melissa's question, how can we replicate this experience in other Latin American governments? Well, I think it is totally scalable in as long as we take into consideration that our city has 1.5 million inhabitants. However, it would be good for many local Latin American governments to attempt this approach because it has one positive external factor, how it helps work on conflict settlement and solving conflict. This is the situation in many Latin American neighborhoods, and many times the state, rather than improving this issue, rather than interfering in the middle of that chaos, many times governments walk away or try to turn the other way because chaos is too big for them to take action. But our invitation is, on the contrary, to include chaos, to include complexity. There's ways around it, there's ways about it, and we will always remain available to you to provide more information. And if you want to get to know this experience, you can always come visit Montevideo.
Thank you, Lucia. That would be great to be able to have these study visits and see this in practice, obviously. So I think we're running late, slightly over time. So I would like to thank you both for generously sharing your experiences and lessons. Today's discussion reminded us that inclusive neighborhoods obviously do not happen by chance, and they require thoughtful and intentional planning. They require data and evidence. They require engagement of communities and strong leadership, but also what I guess Lucia and both Roberto and Lucia emphasized is they require also piloting, testing, learning, and adapting over time, obviously. And an additional aspect that I would like to highlight, obviously, this is a messy process. It's chaotic. And what you, Lucia, just shared is embrace complexity, embrace chaos, because there is a way to do these things. So whether it's improving access to housing, integrating migrants or diverse communities, upgrading underserved areas, cities definitely have the power to drive inclusion from the ground up. And definitely at UNDP, we're committed to supporting local governments and communities to make this happen in practice, because through inclusion at the neighborhood level, we're convinced that this is where the sustainable development actually starts. So we hope that this session will spark some new ideas, connections. Roberto generously offered to people participating to reach out and learn more from his experience. And I believe that Lucia is also open to this. And we hope that this session will also spark some new actions in your work. Thank you again for being with us. And we look forward to continuing this important conversation. Best wishes to everyone.